Good morning, Susie. I'm super excited to have you today.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
Doing great. Well, thank you for joining me. Let's just go ahead and jump right in.
Okay.
Let's start by just in a few sentences telling the audience who you are and what you do.
My name is Susie Schaefer. I'm the founder of Finish the Book Publishing. I'm a certified publishing consultant, which means that I help turn writers into authors by helping them professionally self-publish their books.
Awesome. And I know that you and I work together a lot on that, and I love your work. So I'm excited to hear now more of a personal story that you have to share. And before we get into that, I would like to know, what's your intention with sharing this story today?
My intention today is really just to let people know that they can share their stories and really to bring awareness to, in particular, abusive relationships and ones that maybe are not like physically abusive or an intimate partner abuse, but ones that can really just be along the lines of something that's like control issues, financial, emotional, things like that.
So maybe a little bit more subtle, but just as destructive.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump in. Go ahead and tell me what you want to share with us today, and I might ask some clarifying questions. If you see me kind of move or shake around, let me have the floor.
Okay, so basically a few years ago, I've been divorced now for 4 years, and a few years before my marriage ended, I started noticing changes in my husband's behavior. He worked in law enforcement, and so he dealt with a lot of really very serious situations, graphic deaths, things like that. And so there was, I think, an element with him of post-traumatic stress, which unfortunately he never really dealt with. And I started to see changes in his personality. And I think it really accelerated when his mom passed. And I even had, friends and other people coming to me asking me, what's going on with him and why is, his personality's changed and things like that. And I was seeing more and more situations where there was a lot of control going on. There was a lot of financial decisions that he was making on his own without me. And it really was impacting our relationship. And so I got to the point where, I had drawn a line in the sand, and it was around some financial issues. And he just really just did not care what I had to say, and did not respect my opinion and who I was within the relationship. And he decided to make a huge financial decision behind my back. And I knew that it was time to leave. But because of the changes in his personality and me not really knowing who I was married to anymore, I wasn't sure if things could turn violent. And so I chose to leave and go into a shelter for about a week and a half. My family knew nothing about anything that was going on. I did this completely on my own. I had one friend that knew what was happening, but I chose to go into a shelter for about a week and a half, and make sure that I was not a statistic. I wasn't a number. So that's my story.
Okay. How long had you been in your marriage before you noticed these changes in your husband?
I would say it was probably about the 14th year of our marriage. We were married, well, maybe 13 years. So I would say the last couple of years of our marriage were really difficult. And I think it really stemmed off of the emotional side of what he had been through. Like, for example, he'd seen all these things that happened with his job, but what really kind of, and I equate them to kind of like building blocks. Like when you have emotional things that happen in your life, you kind of build on those. And if you don't take care of them, they just kind of build and build and build. And I think the thing that really kind of triggered his change in his personality was when his mother passed. And so not dealing with that and then having all this leftover stuff from the past really just brought all of that to the surface. And he was not the same person that I had married 14, 15 years before that. And so I think that's really kind of what triggered it. And so, yeah, I mean, it was a gradual thing for sure. And then all of a sudden it was just like within that last year, I was just like, I don't know who this person is anymore. So, and I think when things happen gradually, you tend to make excuses or say, oh, it's not a big deal or whatever. And then pretty soon you get to a point where you realize, wow, this is so different than what I had envisioned, or this person is not the same person anymore.
Yeah. And you had mentioned this big financial thing that happened. Did you see other red flags, or were there other things that were making you be physically afraid for yourself?
Well, yeah, there were. He was developing a short temper and was being a lot more aggressive with me. Um, and I had been talking to my best friend about it, and I said, I just don't understand why, I'm the one who's sacrificed a lot to get us where we're at, in our lives, and yet it just doesn't seem like it's enough. And I kept waiting for like the shoe to drop, like something major to happen. And she finally said to me, she's like, you don't have to wait for something major to happen. And so I was like, oh, okay. So here I was thinking about, how do I approach this? Because I would like to stay married. I would like to be in this relationship, but unless he gets help, I can't really do anything. My hands are tied. That person has to want to get help. And so it was little things that just kept cropping up. And then the big moment happened when I discovered that he had made a huge financial purchase, and I knew nothing about it. And he had leveraged some of our assets and basically told me I had to sign the loan paperwork. And I was like, what? Not going to do it. So that was kind of like the big moment that I've been waiting for something to happen.
Yeah. And I remember you telling me before that because he was in law enforcement, it made it kind of tricky for you to get to that safe house. And I think for a lot of women, that's a scary thought anyway. So tell me a little bit more about that and how that went for you, how you navigated that.
Well, I was actually seeking counseling on my end. And the reason that I was seeking counseling was because I thought I was crazy. And so while we were dealing with our own issues, I was also getting counseling on site to find out, was I actually in an abusive marriage or not? I didn't know the definitions. I didn't know about what does that look like, and those kinds of things. And so when it came time for me to leave, I did it over a time when he was going to be out of town for 3 days. And so I had rented a storage unit. I was working my regular job during the day, and at night I was going to the storage unit and just putting some things in there that I knew I wanted. Things like, mementos, family pictures, yearbooks, things like that. I didn't actually intend to leave forever at that point. I actually thought that I was just going to take a break and get some space and get some clarity on the situation. And so when he left town, I started putting things in the storage unit. And then the day that he came back to town, I worked a half day at my job. My employer had to know what was happening in case things got weird, meaning could potentially violent. And so then I went and checked into the safe house, which had to be in another town because of him being in law enforcement. He knew where the safe houses were. So I was 45 minutes away, and still having to go to work and still having to live my life. And in the meantime, living in this huge safe house that was completely empty except for me, with a panic button, and totally hiding out, and basically calling my family and telling them at that point that I was in this safe house, that I had left and everything else. And so yeah, that was kind of like the beginning. And literally for that entire week and a half that I was in a safe house, looking over my shoulder, not knowing if he was going to show up or what was going to happen, or if I would walk out to my car and get shot.
Right. Did you have a restraining order at that time, or did you?
I never did a restraining order. I probably could have, but I think I honestly thought he would never do anything because of his job. He wouldn't want to lose his job. So I never expected that things would get violent, but you don't know. There's that little voice in the back of your head saying you could be a statistic. So it was just living on like this super high intense awareness for a while. And then, you know, eventually a few months later I moved out of that town. And you know, really that was a huge step for me too, because it gave me that buffer zone that I needed to move away from the small community that I lived in. And really let a lot of friends go too. I mean, there were a lot of casualties as far as friendships and relationships and things like that along the way too.
Yeah, and you had mentioned when you first started moving that you really thought it was temporary. What shifted to make you realize that it was not temporary?
I realized it wasn't temporary when he never asked me to come back. I realized that, oh, he doesn't want me in his life. Um, and it's interesting because what happens is when you're in a situation like that, you very much have tunnel vision. And so you're pretty much going to just do the next thing that you need to do, the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, not realizing that there's a whole world and there's this peripheral vision that you don't have when you're in a situation like that. So you pretty much have tunnel vision. And then afterwards, when you can look back and even just kind of reassess, and sometimes it's as clear as going through like your calendar and things like that and going, oh my gosh, I didn't realize this was happening and this was happening, and things can become really clear at that point. So yeah, when he didn't ask me to come home, I realized, okay, it's over, and I filed for divorce.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like my divorce kind of went that way as well. When I first moved out, it was meant to be temporary. I just thought I needed the space to process and let him get some counseling. And when I realized I had that time away, gave me so much objectivity to see that it wasn't a safe place for me to go back to.
Exactly.
And so I think a lot of women can understand that and should know that sometimes that distance is exactly what you need to get the clarity, because like you said, you were in counseling, not even sure if you were in an abusive relationship. And because we have that tunnel vision, we don't have the objectivity.
Yes. And I should mention too that while, you know, we happen to both be women, this is a situation that can happen with men too. Right now, narcissism is it's the big buzzword. And narcissistic behavior is something that does also trigger some of these other things, but any kind of control issues, whether it be financial, emotional, keeping you from family and friends, um, you know, forcing someone to move to provide a status for them in their lifestyle or something like that. Making all the financial decisions, keeping money from you, anything like that. Those are generally control issues, and those do fall into the category of any kind of intimate partner abuse, domestic abuse, things like that. They don't always have to be violent situations, and I think that's a clarity that a lot of people don't realize. But that it happens between men and women, whether the woman or the man is the aggressor. It can also happen during same-sex partnerships, anything like that. So it's important to think that while women are generally the higher statistic as far as being in abusive type of coercive relationships, it can happen with men, and it can happen in same-sex partner relationships as well. So it's not a one size fits all, definitely.
Yeah. What do you feel like your biggest takeaway was through this experience? What did you learn about yourself or the world or others through this?
Well, I think one of the things that I learned was that it's really important to make sure that you do protect yourself first and foremost. You know, that if you're in a situation like that, you got to get out. You got to be able to get the clarity. You need to get the help you need, and those kinds of things. But then I realized that, you know, I was driving for Lyft, and as a way to supplement my income as I was building my business. And I kept running into these people that I was picking up that I was literally the rescue car for. Like, they would be leaving this abusive relationship. And I realized that, wow, you know, this is one of those things that it is more prevalent than we realize. It's out there. It's just, it's happening all the time. The other thing that I realized is that when you have situations where you have broken relationships, abusive relationships, Many times those lead to broken homes, which means to children being in foster care or in broken homes or runaways or drug abuse or things like that. And you also may have women or men that are lost. And one of the problems that we see in our society now is that these are the kinds of people that are targeted in human trafficking. So not only is abusive situations in home a problem, but it's creating this cycle. And sometimes it's a generational cycle. But this cycle is also feeding into things like human trafficking, which is a huge problem in not only in our society, I mean, in our neighborhoods, but also globally. So I think that's one of the things that I've kind of really learned is that by realizing it's not just me, it's all these people, it's everybody out there has some kind of touch on that. And I think the whole Me Too movement kind of brought a lot of that to the forefront. And now we're seeing at how do these situations where, unless we stop the cycle of abuse and domestic type of control situations, unless we stop the cycle, there are more and more people, whether they're children or adults, that are left in the fray and can be very easily snatched up by people who are in the human trafficking industry.
Well, and speaking of that, I mean, there's nothing more narcissistic and abusive than treating other humans as property. You know,
Exactly.
that it's almost like it's dividing the line between abuser and a victim. And
Exactly.
I'm also interested in seeing all these movements that are happening with, you know, toxic masculinity and the Me Too movement, and how there are a lot of people starting to see these abuses and defining them and getting clear about what really constitutes that and how do we overcome that. So I think it's a really good
Yeah.
conversation for us to be having.
And that's one of the first things I think I would say to anybody is that you need to look at your situation. You need to define, are you in fact in an abusive relationship or not? Sometimes we can just not get along with a spouse or a partner, and that does not constitute abuse. So it's important to figure out what that definition is, and do you fit into that and that kind of situation? Because you know, it's very easy for us to throw these blanket terms out amongst the world and to people in certain situations or cycle or circles. And we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we truly are identifying where there is abuse and where there is not. But again, like you were saying, it's very important to be able to identify and get out of those situations, because it is cyclical. And when a person who comes from a point of being a victim, it's very easy for them to continue to go back into victimhood in other situations. So you have to, coaching, counseling, all those things, getting in touch with, you know, who you are and breaking out of that kind of mold is very, very important.
I agree. I like to watch a lot of ID channel, which is probably not the best food for my brain, but I'm writing a murder mystery, so I kind of need to get that in there. But I've noticed that a lot of victims do stay in the victim mold. So many times I hear them say, this is always forever with me. I will never be okay. And I just think, oh my gosh, they're proclaiming that over their life. Now there's to me, a really important distinction between identifying patterns of behavior and calling them what they are so that you can begin the healing in it. And there's a difference of claiming that title or label and just staying with it, holding on to it forever and ever. We have to go through the healing process. So my next question is, if you could go back and tell your younger self something about this situation, what would you tell her?
I think that I would have said, you need to watch for the flags earlier in this relationship. And now that I look back, of course, there were some, and I definitely, I didn't see them, you know, when you're in love, all that. But I think that I would have told myself to go back and really look at some of those flags and make decisions based off of that versus, just blindly following. And it would have totally changed where my life would have gone. And we wouldn't even be having this conversation right now. But it's okay, because I know that this is kind of the purpose, is to develop, a platform about this and to be speaking on this. So I'm okay with that. But I think I would have told myself, really watch those red flags, because it's one of those things where we will continue to make those same mistakes if we don't identify it and we don't get in touch with it and realize, oh, yes, it's that same type of person that I'm inviting into my life. So, yeah.
I agree. Is there anything you want to say to wrap up before I ask our silly question to lighten the topic and mood?
I just say, hey, if you're, my contact information is obviously on here. If you're a person that's in a situation like that and you want to reach out to me, please do. You can get me through my website. I'm actually working on my book, which talks about, really how I did it, how I got out. Because I think that's important too, to have a plan. And so I'm gonna share that with other people, and I'm hoping to have my book out next year.
Very good. I'm excited, and I know someone who can help you get your book out. Like, you're going to help me get my book done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Susie. I'm going to ask you, what is one of your things that you're just loving right now? Maybe a guilty pleasure or something that you're just all about right now that's bringing you joy?
A guilty pleasure. I don't know. That wasn't one of the questions. Okay, so
something bringing you joy. Like, are you a pumpkin spice person? Are you excited for this trend?
I used to be a pumpkin spice person, but I'm not really anymore. I think I'm kind of over it. I think really just really working on my business, really developing that, and the connections that I make through that. That's really kind of my guilty pleasure right now. So, and then of course going to the beach whenever I can. So
right.
That's always a good thing.
Beach is always a great way to unwind. Yeah, very good. Well, thank you so much, Susie. I have all of your contact information included so that people can reach out to you to talk about your business, to talk about personal, whatever they feel pulled you for. So again, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Chris. It's always good to see you. Take care.
I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks.